The Pittsburgh Steelers are entering the 2026 season with something that hasn't truly been felt in years. Clarity across the roster, especially at the quarterback position, and a structure that finally looks intentional from top to bottom. And when you break down what's happening right now, the biggest storyline isn't just who's starting, and it's how everything is being set up for both the present and the future at the same time. All signs point to Aaron Rodgers being positioned as QB1 heading into the offseason program, assuming nothing unexpected happens. And that alone already tells you a lot about the direction of this team. This is not a rebuild in the traditional sense. This is a controlled transition. Behind him, the situation gets even more interesting. Mason Rudolph and Will Howard have been splitting first-team reps, which signals a real competition for that QB2 spot. And then there's Drew Aller, a third-round pick who is almost guaranteed a roster spot, but clearly seen as a long-term project rather than an immediate option, and this is where things get strategic. The presence of Rodgers isn't just about winning now, although inside the locker room, players still believe he gives them the best chance to do exactly that. It's also about development. Aller in particular is viewed as someone who needs time. His footwork, his overall readiness for the NFL level, it's not there yet, and instead of forcing that timeline, the Steelers are doing something they haven't always done. They're being patient. You let Rodgers lead, you let him stabilize the offense, and at the same time, you create an environment where young quarterbacks can actually learn instead of survive. That's a massive shift in philosophy. And if everything goes according to plan, by the time you reach 2027, this team will have a real decision to make. Is Drew Aller ready to take over, or do you go back into the draft and look for another option? Now, moving beyond the quarterbacks, the offensive structure starts to reveal even more about how this team wants to operate. In the backfield, Jaylen Warren and Rico Dowdle headline a group that isn't just about starters, but about versatility and depth. There's a clear intention to have multiple usable pieces, including hybrid-type players who can line up in different roles. That flexibility becomes even more evident when you look at how they're building the receiving core. The addition of Jermaine Burton stepping into that WR3 role, alongside DK Metcalf and Michael Pittman Jr., creates a very specific identity, size, physicality, and the ability to stretch defenses in multiple ways. And it also quietly pushes Roman Wilson into a more specialized rotational role, which might actually suit him better at this stage. At tight end, the duo of Pat Freiermuth and Darnell Washington continues to be one of the more intriguing parts of this offense, especially when you consider the potential return of heavier formations, something Rodgers himself has shown appreciation for. That 6 offensive lineman look could very well become a real weapon again. And speaking of the offensive line, this might be where the biggest question still exists. The development of younger players like the recently drafted linemen will determine just how high this offense can go. There's talent there, no doubt, but whether they're ready to contribute immediately is something that will only be answered once real competition begins. What stands out in all of this is that nothing feels random. Every position group has a purpose. Every decision connects to a bigger picture. This isn't just about assembling talent, it's about building a system that can evolve over time without collapsing in the process. So when you step back and look at the full offensive picture, the question becomes unavoidable. Are the Steelers building something that can truly compete right now while also preparing for a seamless transition into the future? Or are they taking a calculated risk that depends too heavily on everything going exactly as planned? And when you flip to the defensive side of the ball, that same sense of intentional planning becomes even more obvious. This isn't just a unit filled with recognizable names. It's a group that looks carefully constructed to adapt depending on the situation, something that has been missing at times in recent years for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Start with the front 7, and the identity still begins with pressure. TJ Watt and Alex Highsmith remain the anchors on the edge, and even without major additions in that specific area during the draft, the expectation is clear. This defense will continue to rely on them to disrupt everything. Behind them, you still have the veteran presence of Cameron Hayward combined with rotational depth that now includes newer pieces being integrated into the system. It's not about one dominant name across the entire line. It's about waves of players who can keep the intensity high, but the real shift may come in how this defense aligns. There's a growing expectation that the Steelers will lean more heavily into 4-man fronts and nickel looks, which signals a philosophical adjustment. That matters because it directly connects to what might be the most intriguing part of this entire defense: versatility in the secondary. Look at how Jalen Ramsey is expected to be used, not just as a traditional defensive back, but as a hybrid piece who can move between safety, slot, and even box responsibilities depending on the formation. That kind of flexibility opens the door for more complex looks, especially when paired with players like Jaquan Brisker stepping into a more defined role alongside him. Add in Joey Porter Jr. and Jamel Dean on the outside, and suddenly this secondary starts to look less like a weakness and more like a potential strength, and that's a major development when you consider how inconsistent that group was not long ago. The difference now isn't just talent, it's fit. Players are being placed in positions that align with what they do best, rather than being forced into roles that don't maximize their abilities. That alone can completely change how a defense performs week to week. At linebacker, Patrick Queen is expected to continue as the signal caller, wearing the green dot and leading the unit. The rotation around him, including younger players trying to establish themselves as reliable every down options, will be something to watch closely, because if that second level becomes more consistent, it could unlock the full potential of everything happening both in front and behind them. And then when you zoom out and look at the full roster, offense, defense, and even special teams with Chris Boswell and Cameron Johnston providing stability, it becomes harder to ignore the bigger picture that's forming here. This might be the most complete Steelers roster in years. Not perfect, not without questions, but balanced in a way that feels different. There's a clear blend of veteran leadership and young development. There's depth in key areas. And most importantly, there's a plan that connects everything together, from bringing in a quarterback like Aaron Rodgers to mentoring the next generation to reshaping the defense into something more adaptable and modern. But here's where it gets interesting for you as a fan, because all of this, the structure, the depth, the strategy, and ultimately leads to one simple reality. Expectations are about to rise. This is no longer a team that can hide behind the idea of rebuilding or figuring things out. If Rodgers is indeed leading this offense, if the defense performs the way it's designed to, then the standard changes immediately. Competing for a playoff spot isn't enough anymore. The conversation shifts toward how far this team can actually go. So now it comes down to belief. Do you think this roster, as it's currently built, is truly strong enough to compete at the highest level this season? And more importantly, do you believe this plan will actually work the way it's been designed to? And there's one more layer to this that can't be ignored, because beyond the depth chart, beyond the names, beyond the scheme changes, what really defines whether this all works is how quickly this team can come together once real competition begins. Because on paper, everything makes sense. You have leadership with Aaron Rodgers. You have a defensive identity built around playmakers like TJ Watt. You have a secondary that looks more flexible than it has in years. But the NFL is never played on paper. It's about execution, chemistry, and timing. Especially early in the season. Think about the offense for a second. You're potentially integrating a veteran quarterback into a system that also needs to develop young talent at the same time. That balance isn't always easy. Rodgers will need protection, which puts immediate pressure on the offensive line to perform from day one. At the same time, receivers like DK Metcalf and Michael Pittman Jr. will need to build that on-field connection quickly, because in tight games, timing is everything. On defense, it's a similar story. The pieces are there, but communication in more complex schemes, especially with hybrid roles like the one expected from Jalen Ramsey, takes time to fully click. One missed assignment, one hesitation, and big plays happen. So while the upside is high, the margin for error early on could be just as real, and this is where coaching quietly becomes one of the biggest factors in the entire equation. Adjustments, game planning, putting players in the right situations. If this staff truly has improved, as many believe, then this is the year it has to show up in results, not just potential. Because let's be honest, the expectations around the Pittsburgh Steelers are changing whether anyone says it out loud or not. When you build a roster like this, when you bring in a quarterback like Rodgers, when you invest in both sides of the ball the way they have, you're signaling that you're ready to compete now. And that brings everything back to you. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just about projections or depth charts. It's about what you believe this team can actually become once the season starts. Are we looking at a team that finally puts all the pieces together and makes a serious run? Or is this a situation where expectations might be getting ahead of reality? Because if you really zoom in on what could separate this team from being just good to legitimately dangerous, it comes down to a few subtle but critical details that don't always show up in headlines. Take situational football, for example. Over the past few seasons, that's been an area where the Pittsburgh Steelers have struggled to stay consistent. Third downs, red zone efficiency, closing closing out tight games. Those are the moments that define playoff caliber teams. And now, with a veteran presence like Aaron Rodgers potentially leading the offense, there's an expectation that those moments will start to swing in Pittsburgh's favor more often than not. But expectations don't guarantee results. Rodgers brings experience, no doubt. He's seen every defensive look imaginable. He understands tempo. He knows how to control a game late, but he's also stepping into a system that still has young, evolving pieces. That means communication has to be sharp. Adjustments at the line of scrimmage have to be understood by everyone, not just the quarterback. One missed read by a receiver, one protection breakdown, and those critical moments can flip instantly. And then there's the running game. It might not get the same attention as the passing attack, but it could quietly become one of the biggest keys to this entire offense. If players like Jaylen Warren can establish consistency on early downs, it changes everything. It keeps the offense ahead of the chains, opens up play action, and most importantly, it takes pressure off Rodgers to do everything himself. Now shift back to the defense, because this is where games can truly be controlled. We already know what TJ Watt brings to the table: disruption, game-changing plays, leadership. But what elevates a defense isn't just star power, it's reliability across all levels. Can the interior hold up against the run consistently? Can the linebackers limit yards after contact? Can the secondary avoid giving up explosive plays? Those are the questions that will define whether this defense becomes dominant or just solid. And here's the part that fans don't always like to hear. Health is going to play a massive role in all of this. Depth has improved, yes, but every team looks deeper in the offseason. Once injuries start to happen, and they always do, that's when you find out how real that depth actually is. So when you put everything together, what you have is a team that feels closer than it has in a long time, but also one that still has to prove it can handle the weight of expectation. Because this isn't about sneaking into the playoffs anymore. This is about whether the Pittsburgh Steelers can take that next step and become a team that other contenders actually worry about. And that's where I want to leave it with you. When you look at everything we've broken down across this roster, from the quarterback plan to the defensive adjustments, from the young talent to the veteran leadership, because once you strip everything down, the names, the projections, the offseason optimism, what really determines how far the Pittsburgh Steelers go in 2026 is identity. Not the one they talk about, but the one they actually show on the field week after week. Are they going to be a team that leans into physical football, controls the clock, and lets the defense dictate the tone? Or are they ready to evolve into something more dynamic, more aggressive, especially with a quarterback like Aaron Rodgers potentially running the offense? Because trying to be both can be dangerous if it's not executed properly. If you look at the personnel, there are clear signs that this team wants flexibility. They want to be able to adapt depending on the opponent. Against stronger defenses, maybe you slow things down, rely on the run game with Jaylen Warren, control possession. But in games where you need to score, you open it up, you trust your receivers like DK Metcalf to make plays downfield, and you let Rodgers do what he's